Good day. Excited to have everyone here. We'll give folks a few minutes, minute or two to log in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And don't be shy. Feel free to say hi in the chat box. Let us know you're here. I'm seeing the registrations, the attendees coming in fast and furious, which is great to see. Okay. Awesome. Oh, hi, Micah. I see you in the chat there. Good to see you. All right. Okay, we're about a minute in, so why don't we go ahead and get started? We have a ton of great content to cover. First of all, a warm welcome to all of our attendees. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Lisa Wilding Brown. I'm the CEO of Innovate MR. We are a global B2B and consumer sampling and field services agency headquartered in Calabasas, California. And we are absolutely so thrilled to be hosting this webinar called The Role of Research Powering What Matters in DEI. Our team, the Multicultural Insights Collective, will be sharing original research on how we should talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion to drive workplace equity and elevate business outcomes. Now, a bit more about us. We are a group of research veterans who are dedicated to understanding how people talk about diversity, and we work closely with brands who are leading with intention as it relates to DEI initiatives designed to amplify diverse voices. So how did we get started? Well, in 2020, I got a phone call from MIC's fearless leader, Carrie Edelstein. And like Carrie, I was deeply troubled by the performative and shallow actions we are observing from many brands online, as well as the blatant lack of representation of marginalized groups in survey research. So we asked ourselves, how can we provide a voice to diverse segments of the population if our industry does not strive to understand the intersectionality of people and fails to include adequate sample sizes by which to draw actionable conclusions? Rather than just talking the talk, our team put our words into action by launching a wildly successful 4-phase research initiative called Words Matter to help identify best practices for speaking internally as well as externally about racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and of course, representation. One of our key learnings was that the most common online conversation among DEI advocates was not focused on strategies for inclusion, but rather how to combat backlash. So today, we'll be taking a deep dive into this topic of navigating and managing backlash. And our experts here will be discussing the different types of naysayers, which may surprise you to learn are not all white. We will explore how to better understand drivers of skepticism to break down those barriers to progress, and we'll showcase brands that are already leading the way in cultural representation that avoids these skepticism traps. So our group here includes some absolutely incredible experts that I want to introduce you to. Carrie Edelstein is the founder and president of Research Narrative. Damian Taylor is the co-founder of Prometheus Digital Studio. Michaela Mora, founder and CEO of Relevant Insights. Delphine Lomax Taylor, principal of VNL Research and Consulting. And Candace Hockett, owner of CHH Consulting. Working alongside this team of folks has been just one of the greatest privileges of my career. And not only are these some of the brightest minds that I've ever personally collaborated with, but now I consider them lifelong friends. So for today's webinar, Damian, Carrie, and Michaela will walk us through some of our research, and then we'll get into Q&A. And as a reminder, this webinar is going to last about an hour. So those that are unable to attend live or attend the full session, not to worry, we are recording the webinar, and we'll be planning to share that out with all the registrants shortly after the event concludes. And we love questions, so please do not be shy. Please feel free to engage us in the chat or submit a question in the Q&A box. And our team would also be happy to connect with any of those folks that are attending today after our webinar, should you wish to do a deeper dive into the research and have a more fulsome discussion. So with that, I will pass it over to Damian to kick things off for us. Over to you, Damian.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're really excited to be here presenting to everyone. To really dive into what we're going to discuss today, we need to go back to 2020 and give you a little a little background on how we got to where we are and some of the foundations of the research that we'll be talking about. So if we can all just kind of rewind really quick back to that year 2020, it was a crazy year, and some of the things that we saw really around diversity and equity, inclusion, were we saw Black Lives Matter, a big renewal there, and companies starting to come into the fold and supporting Black Lives Matter. We saw a really strong sense of urgency, not just from individuals, but from corporations and brands as well. And they all wanted to speak about what was going on in the events that we saw unfolding during that year. Within that, though, especially from corporations and brands, we saw that there was an inconsistency between what's being said internally and what was being said externally. You'll have posts of, this is really great, we're supporting it, Black Lives Matter, but then that may not match the internal reality of what was happening in the company. So if we go back to really focus on that internal versus external communication part, this next slide, we'll dive into that a little bit more. We saw brands like Starbucks outwardly posting on their social media, in the news, saying, we support Black Lives Matter, we're there for you. And then within that same week, same day, even sometimes within hours, firing an employee for wearing a Black Lives Matter pin or a shirt. And so with that, we started to see that disconnect having an impact on how consumers and how employees even were they willing to trust the company? Was it lip service? Were companies really devoted to what was happening and making substantive change, or was it all something that was just a marketing ploy? And you'll see it'll be a theme going throughout what we talk about, but there's really a lot of skepticism that's bred from inconsistencies in terms of actions and what's being said. So moving to the next phase, what we decided to do is we knew that we really wanted to create something to help brands and corporations speak about diversity and equity and all of these social justice conversations in a way that was both respectful, but also provided a framework for action. And to do that, we came up with these 4 primary objectives about what we wanted to do in our research. The first was find what those best practices were, how you talk about something internally and how you speak about it externally, especially around DEI topics and Black Lives Matters, et cetera, during the time. And then we wanted to highlight how can a business accelerate positive change? So not just talk about it and sort of sweep it under the rug after it was done, or get stalled in sort of those never-ending circular conversations. What can we help those businesses do to actually move the needle forward? Thirdly, look at where efforts have mistaken. We mentioned earlier the Starbucks example. We're there, Black Lives Matter, you're fired for wearing a pin within the same day, which is the irony of it, right? We wanted to point out where were those places where there were inconsistencies that actually hurt those DEI efforts that companies and brands were putting forth. And fourthly, come up with a plan, a playbook that can be a structural guide on how you can effectively communicate about these large diversity and equity, inclusion, representation topics. To do that, we came up with a 4-phase study that was conducted over the time of a year. So during this time, it was all of 2021, this research was happening. And the first phase, we really wanted to take time to understand what is the current state of things. What's the status quo? How are people talking about it? What did they talk about? It was a digital anthropology study of sorts. And in that, it really allowed us to understand, one, what people were saying, and then with some quant research, understanding a little bit of the why they were saying or discussing things the way that they did. We followed that up then with some understanding in terms of contextualizing those conversations we saw. How did we get to those points that we're talking about, whatever the topics were that we were seeing come up? And providing that historical context, going through literature reviews, seeing things like critical race theory that were suddenly becoming really prominent in the zeitgeist, but they had a really long historical academic life before that, and understanding what was the initial creation of that and what was it actually versus what we as the populace know of it now, so that we can start to connect those things and understand how did we get from A to B. From there, then we were ready to actually now talk to consumers. We understood what people were talking about. We understood the origins and sometimes the things that are even on the docket coming soon. And now we wanted to be able to talk to consumers and really understand their perspectives. How did this play into their beliefs, their actions? How did it translate into what they bought, what they didn't buy, which services were they willing to participate in, and their trust or distrust of brands? And then after that last phase, go into a phase where we're really now taking the consumer conversations and all of those things we've done previously and building out a roadmap. How do we really now take this and do something actionable that's going to be effective and resonate with consumers? Again, at the end of the day, we wanted to be able to give brands a way for them to speak both internally and externally. And so being able to connect now all of these things that they've learned and turn them into action was a critical phase in this last portion of our research. So with that, I'll pass it along to Michaela, who's going to go into the insights that came in from the research.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. This was a very exciting project. And if there is something we learned quickly in the early stages of our research is that diversity has many definitions in America. Next. And it's not just about race. It's more than just black and white. Of course, race is one of the dimensions of the diversity, but so are gender, age, religion, and geographic region, cultural ancestry, socioeconomic conditions, the ability spectrum, and even hair and body types. All these dimensions are part of our individual experiences that impact how we see the world and other people around us. There is a lot of diversity in how we define diversity. Still, we saw some patterns in the degree to which more or fewer dimensions were included in this definition. We notice how the idea of diversity becomes more expansive and inclusive with younger Americans, particularly if they're multiracial. These younger generations and multiracial Americans have a wider view of diversity and talk about accepting and celebrating differences, similar to how we usually prepare salads, in which each ingredient keeps its own identity while adding flavor and color to the whole salad without denying unifying aspects of the American culture, which functions as the salad dressing. Older Americans across races, however, tend to focus on a couple of dimensions, usually race or gender, and instead of celebrating differences, they think in terms of assimilation and unity and togetherness, similar to a melting pot to avoid discrimination. Next. Should brands and companies get involved in the conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion? In the last phase of our research, we heard a resounding yes. Nearly 80% of consumers agree with the statement, it's the role and responsibility of companies and brands to engage in these conversations. This came from the largest group discussion we conducted online with almost 400 participants, in which they could show agreement or disagreement with answers from other participants. Next. Despite this high level of agreement, we still found a fairly vocal group that wasn't sure about this. Among the 4 groups listed here, we found that the white, non-Hispanic baby boomers, both men and women, show a wider distribution in their agreement, with 38% agreeing and the same number disagreeing with the statement that brands and companies should engage in these conversations. Next. The disagreement usually shows up as skepticism, and this skeptical group can be very, very loud, creating a fear of speaking and bringing your whole self to work. And behind this fear is an expectation of a strong and negative reactions from others, essentially a backlash. So we heard about backlash in the first phase of the research when we were exploring online conversations around diversity, but the topic kept coming back and back again as a barrier to diversity and inclusion efforts, especially when expressed through naysayers. So now Carrie will talk about the different type of naysayers we encounter.
Thank you. So we thought this was a really important point that came out of our first phase of research, that as we looked into that cultural anthropology Damien mentioned, different types of conversations having around multiculturalism and DEI, we expected to see lots of advocacy conversations about how to propel representation. And what we found is that the most common conversation was how to prevent backlash. how to manage backlash. And so we thought, well, that's so interesting. And as we went into later stages of our research, we really dug into that. Why is that happening? Why are we talking more about how to prevent backlash than we are about how to propel the positive representation? So there's actually not just one type of naysayer, it turns out. If you go to the next slide, we often think of that classic, like, I'm not a racist, type of naysayer that is often an older, as Michelle put it, an older white baby boomer, not always men, but often men. And that does exist. That is, in fact, one type of naysayer that we do here. And they tend to sound the most overt of all the different naysaying or backlash groups. So they will say, and this is a literal quote from our focus groups, they will say things like, I think all this diversity, blah, blah, equity, it's all evil. It's all divisive. There are two kinds of people, the decent and the indecent. I don't care what color they are. So there's a sort of denial of differential experiences and this oversimplification of identity that does come from this group. However, one of the things we learned very quickly is that skepticism can come from people we might expect to see allies. And the reason for that is what we identified at the start of this project, which was a disconnect between what brands tend to say and what they tend to do. And so they bring this skepticism to the workplace because they've been around the block and they see inaction over the course of decades even. So we heard this a lot when we were talking to a group that we would call Zennials or young Gen Xers, people who are now in their 40s. We heard a lot of this skepticism from people of color in that age demographic. And it can sound like something like, I'm apprehensive to believe it. Most companies just talk a big game without backing it up. So they want to believe it, but they don't. So they're coming to DEI from a place of skepticism because they've been hearing the promises for so long. Next slide. Another group that we often hear from is, and Michelle alluded to this with the melting pot, is groups that really seek to be cultural assimilators. They want to assimilate to a central, in this case, American identity. And I realize we've got a lot of international people on this webinar, which is fantastic. We should probably preface this by saying we did this study specific to the United States. So these findings are probably some things you're going to hear that could be extrapolated to other countries. But in terms of the specific types of demographic dimensions we looked at, that was specific to the United States. And so this idea of the melting pot is a very kind of classically American concept. And you'll hear people talking about cultural assimilation as if that is a destination everyone is looking for. And again, that's not necessarily true. Some people think of the destination as being a little bit more like a Cobb salad, where there's different pieces in the mix, and together they create something tasty and delicious and wonderful, but they maintain their individual identity. And so that's a very different concept. So sometimes backlash can come from people who really want assimilation to be the destination and don't like the idea that it might not be. Another group that we heard from, and this tends to be a little bit of an older group too, because they tend to have adult children, is what we call the interracial marriage denier. So we did a number of groups where we talked to people where one of the adults in a marriage was Asian or Hispanic or Black, and the other one was white. And one of the things we would hear them talk about is, my kids are biracial. We know they're mixed race, but it's really just not a big deal to them. Can't we all just get along? That's the bottom line. And they talk about their children as if that's not something their children would think about. However, when we did research with their children's generation, which is 20s and early 30s for the most part, and we talked to people who were mixed race of those younger generations, younger millennials and Zoomers, what we would hear from them is not only, to Michela's earlier point, a very clear and very detailed understanding of the word diversity, a much more nuanced understanding of the word diversity, but a sense that they were living a dual identity, if not more than two identities. So they would talk about, my Hispanic family and my white family, and they were different cultures. And they were very specific about that. They would also often talk about how the white parent would sometimes deny the fact that they had another identity. So we heard, for example, from one woman who says, my parent just doesn't understand that I identify as Chinese because half of my family is Chinese, and that's a big part of my identity, and my white parent just doesn't acknowledge that. So it was really interesting that from the parent generation, we were often hearing, this isn't a big deal, my kids don't think about it too much, whereas from the younger generation who lived it, who were, identifying as biracial or mixed race. They very much did think about it all the time, and they could talk very eloquently about it. So there was a disconnect there with their parents sort of denying their younger generation that experience. And then the last two types we came across, they kind of look like bystanders, right? They don't necessarily say anything overtly racist. And by the way, they're not always white. That's another thing I want to point out. We can hear some of this skepticism coming from people of color. So one of the things we heard is people who'd been through diversity training. That tends to happen more when you're talking to people in their 30s and 40s. They've gone through some of this already. And they will message that training incorrectly. So we heard people talking to us about what equity was, and they just got the definition wrong. And they will say things like it's a boost because of underrepresentation, which kind of has a pejorative connotation to it, right? This idea that they need a boost because they're underrepresented, rather than they had a differential experience and we should customize to that differential experience. There's this sort of idea that we're helping them without the acknowledgement that maybe other demographics had been helped at other stages in their lives. And that was a correction. So there was a repetition of some things that were not quite right that was continuing to accelerate backlash. And then one of the things we heard loud and clear is this assumption that DEI efforts were running against the idea of merit. So we would hear these ideas that might sound kind of ludicrous to you, like, literal quote, life should be based, it should be merit-based. I don't want a Black pilot on my airplane because he's Black or white for that matter, if he doesn't pass the test to be a pilot. Two thoughts about that quote. One, nobody is flying an airplane without passing the test. That doesn't happen. That's not real. So there's these things being said that are just kind of inherently false and being repeated. And this assumption that the system wouldn't have merit if there was a correction for equity. Also, there's an assumption here we call unconscious bias that the pilot's a he. Right? So implicit in this is sort of some of the other biases that get repeated. But there's this idea that if we do DEI systems, we're countering merit instead of creating new systems that are more meritocratic than the existing systems. Next slide. So the interesting thing about all this is that the skepticism actually has similar roots for all these different groups. So one of them, and this is something that we picked up on early on, it was the origin of MIC, is that DEI or racial justice or social justice is not a marketing activity. It's an internal activity. And only later on, when you've built up the internal foundation, do you really have permission to do marketing about it. But it started out as a marketing activity, and that's created backlash. And of course, that skepticism then creates this delta of words versus actions, right? Because they're speaking all this externally, but they're not delivering behind the scenes with foundational DEI programs. The other thing is that people aren't that excited about jargon. So I don't want to say that words don't matter, because they do matter, but stories matter more. Personal stories, stories of systems and what people experience matter much more than the lexicon. So a lot of times we even see in advocacy and ally language a focus on specific vocabulary, and that actually generally doesn't speak to people. It's not really about the word you're using, that's just a catch-all for an idea. It's much more about the story, your lived experience, what happened to you and how that happened, and the idea behind that. And stories are also more memorable. What's interesting is that both groups believe in meritocracy. The question is whether or not, and when I say both groups, I mean allies who are skeptical, as well as naysayers who really maybe don't believe in DEI programs. But they both really believe in this idea of meritocracy. So I'm going to pass it back to Damien, who's going to walk you through some of the research we saw on that.
So when we decided to start really digging in and understanding the drivers of the skepticism Carrie mentioned, one of the main things that came up was, especially for corporations, it felt like a marketing gimmick. And if you think about it, you have now brands touting Black Lives Matter, but then you see what's happening internally, or we're all for equity, but then you look at their boards and there's no diversity. You're starting to see why people felt like it was a gimmick. It was something that they never talked about before until there was this big social upheaval, and now you're talking about it. Why now? Was the question that a lot of the people we spoke to asked, both in qualitative and the quantitative study. The other piece, and Carrie alluded to this before, is there's the talk without the action. And so we had a lot of brands wanting credit for it, saying they were going to do something, but they'd never done anything in the past and didn't show actual proof that they were going to actually do anything in the future aside from having said it. And in both of those cases, we started to really understand that a lot of times what happened with DEI, especially during that time period, but continues to this day, is it first started as a marketing activity. We have to say something, quick say something so we can look great. We have to make sure that we look like we're in alignment with whatever, but there was never the work done internally to actually make the changes necessary to provide substantive action towards those goals or values that the company was espousing. So if we go to the next slide, what we'll really see is another piece of that, and Carrie alluded to this, is how people are talking about diversity, how you define it. It was probably one of the most interesting parts of this study is that there are a bajillion different versions of diversity and how it's defined. Everyone has a different definition. And we realized that as people started laying into jargon and really trying to use that as a shortcut to describe things, it actually created more problems because, well, people don't all define diversity the same. So if you say I'm talking about diversity and what you really meant was women, you should say women versus diversity, and then bring in people who are all male, but they're diverse across race. And there's this idea, especially amongst consumers and even employees, that brands shouldn't talk about race, ethnicity, gender, etc., as if those are the only things that matter. Things that came up in our conversation was we always talk about these things as being diversity, but there's also religion, there's age. So there are other facets of diversity that should be considered. Even your ability, whether you're really fully abled or if you're physically challenged, whatever it may be, those things were a lot of times left out of the conversation. And for a lot of people, if that was something that was important to you, it felt like then you weren't really speaking about diversity, you were being performative. The last part is when we're talking about systematic racism and the idea of merit, Carrie alluded to this a little bit, that a lot of times the way that it was discussed actually made it so that whoever was in that role or whatever that position was already coming from a position of derision to some extent, that this was a less than or a sub qualified person. The conversations around those diversity programs was never around the qualification of the individual or what they bring to the table or why we're looking for individuals who have this specific life experience. Instead, it was about their gender, their age, whatever insert your brand of diversity here. Whereas a lot of times there were really legitimate business reasons for this person brings us this experience who does X, Y, and Z, but that never was communicated. So the idea of merit was lost just because the way that it was positioned and the way that the brand was built was around, let's pick a diversity and just talk about the thing that is challenging. So if we go to our next slide, what we'll see is coming into the conversation of how do we counter skepticism, one of the biggest things that we saw was actually doing the work first and then promoting what you've done versus just talking about it. Along with that, there were things like defining what you mean. So don't say diversity, say, we're talking about bringing women and people of color who've traditionally been challenged or whatever the group is, be specific in that so that people have a clear understanding of what you meant. A lot of times the jargon actually created more problems than it actually solved because people understood it differently. This seems like something that might be impossible for brands, that it's an insurmountable mountain or an obstacle, but throughout the entire process of this research, one brand came up consistently over and over. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. And it was a retail brand that was very consistently getting credit, unprompted, without even having been mentioned. Everyone asked, but what about blah, blah, blah? Even people who came back with the very skeptical, I don't like this diversity, blah, blah, blah. We literally had a gentleman come in and tell us that diversity is crap. I don't believe in any of it. And then said, when I come into Target, so for everyone who knows, the answer is Target, but when I go into Target, I don't feel like I'm being ostracized or pointed out or left behind. Mind you, this is someone who's incredibly skeptical, very confrontational when it came to the conversation of diversity. But then Target was the pinnacle of how he felt welcomed and invited. So we have a brief video to kind of walk through some of the conversations that we heard. We have some audio to share with you from the actual people we spoke to when they talk about their experiences with Target.
One of the first companies to do was Target, where they raised the minimum wage to living wages, $15 an hour. And then it sort of created like a slow avalanche where you have others like the Walmarts, the Amazons, where not only stepping out trying to raise the minimum wages, but they're also offering scholarships, educational scholarships for employees. So I think they recognize the sins of the past where people can live on, $8, $9, $10 an hour. So they're slowly moving up to the $15 an hour, which hopefully could be living wages, depending upon where these people they're hiring live. So I think that's a nice redistribution of some of the inequities.
Okay, for me, I think Target, because for a little while now, I see them trying to make sure the Black entrepreneurs are seen, are heard. Like when I walk into Target, I see some products from Black entrepreneurs, and I see the ads on TV as well. And even kids, kids with disabilities, kids who normally don't see themselves out there, they make them understand that they are being heard, they are being seen. For example, the ad on Target I saw recently was about a boy who was on a wheelchair, and he saw a boy like him in Target on a toy, and he just kept staring at the toy like, oh, okay, so that means there's a boy like me out there. So I think Target is doing a good job including diverse people, kids, adults, Black people, from different walks of life into what they are giving out there. And
for me, America represents different body shapes as well. And I think Target, when you walk into Target and you see mannequins of different shapes and sizes, that's really, really good, because Target is saying, you know what, America, people don't look like those perfect mannequins, right, that they had in the past. So I think if you run advertisements, don't make everybody look super like supermodels. Make them look normal, right?
When I go to Target, I don't feel like I'm being shunned, or Cub Foods, or Starbucks. I don't feel like I'm being looked down upon. I feel like we're being treated with respect. When I'm at work, when I was working with people of different colors, we all treated each other equally, like we're all respectful, because we're all working on the same team. We're all trying to do the same task and get it done for each other, and we work with each other and help each other. Got nothing to do with any of this color and equity crap.
For me, I think the company that speaks the most to me, that does, the most authentic branding, for me would be Target. I say Target because they do a lot with, first, just speaking to the whole community, the community of color. They do a lot, as far as hiring on designers and really just having product in their store, not only just for apparel, but also for, hair care, which is another difficult market at times. I think they also speak a lot to the Latina community. So if you go in there, and just their vast variety of different products. So in the store, I think when you walk in, and if you are someone of color, someone of Caucasian, a Latina American, so I think they just do a really phenomenal job of speaking to the different races, but then also the different community groups, like the LGBTQ community. They have a lot of different components there. And then just also from a HR perspective, their HR initiatives, the diversity and inclusion that the company has, their hiring and recruiting practices are very ethical. So for me, Target does it.
I guess that's me again. So what's next? You go to the next one. So in our quest to answer the fundamental question of how we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation, we learned that advocates of DEI don't always make a connection between greater social events and DEI efforts, but consumers and employees, as you notice in the video, do that. And that's what we saw in 2020, when the actions and messages from many brands were inconsistent with the individual stories and experiences of many customers and employees, particularly from diverse groups. Unfortunately, many brands are going back to their old habits now and are forgetting again that customers and employees are still watching. And so we believe that researchers can help keep this issue front and center for management, help translate experiences, thoughts, and feelings of employees and consumers, and guide management's actions. So we ask researchers in the audience to think about how you can be an interpreter of those conversations. Next. At the same time, researchers should not stop with data interpretation. We can be central to the effective implementation of a DEI and multicultural strategies. Next. So we found that employees and customers are paying attention and comparing what companies are doing and saying internally and externally. So we need research insights from both groups, combined with expertise in DEI from the industry and academia, to co-create a holistic plan with goals, actions, and metrics that can help embody DEI at all levels and allow companies to talk about it in an authentic way. The key word here is co-creation. This should not be a top-down activity. It should start with research at the employee and customer level. It should start with listening to how your employees and customers define diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how they experience and would like to experience those concepts in their lives. The good news is that this is totally doable, like the Target example that we saw and show, but it requires investment. So Carrie will discuss some of our ideas about how this investment could look like.
Thank you. And before I continue on, I know there's lots of questions. Please, we're going to be doing a Q&A after this, so submit your questions, because as I think about this, we've probably, over the course of all of Words Matter, did between 6 and 8 hours of presentations around this that we've now distilled into 30 minutes. So you probably have a lot of questions, and we encourage you to ask. But we would be very good researchers if we didn't learn from our own research, would we? So one of the things we did at the end of Words Matter is we went back to the sponsors of it, and someone asked us in the chat, we had 7 different corporate sponsors. And we didn't plan this, but ironically, one of them turned out to be Target. They're probably pretty happy with the outcomes of this, but that was not a plant. And we asked them, what are the things that are top of mind? And one of the things that had come out of this research very loud and clear is that the work around inclusion and representation really has to start internally, and that starts with the workplace. That was a very loud and clear finding of our research that we expected. That was a hypothesis going in, but it was the number one insight coming out, certainly. But the other thing that happened in this period of time was COVID. And in that period of time, the workplace dramatically changed. So a lot of us have probably gone through that we went from being in offices to maybe being remote or being in hybrid workplaces. We started to see some research come out about that, but what it wasn't looking at was the intersectionality of that future of work. We were also hearing about mental health and wellness coming out of COVID and how that was affecting people in the workplace. So one of the things that we were observing and learning from our research, as well as hearing reflected back to us from our corporate sponsors, was that the future of work is the number one thing that's on their minds right now. And that all of this levels up into that. So our next initiative is going to focus on that future of work. Can you go back one slide a little bit, Lisa? Sorry. So we're going to be doing, again, our everything MIC is focused on foundational research at its core. So we don't do advisory without foundational research. That's what differentiates us. That's what defines us. So there will be a large scale national study, but there will be benchmarking research associated with that, individual companies through employee surveys and custom integrations as well. We're going to be doing large samples so we can look at intersectionality and look at different groups, the cross-section of things like, generation and racial identity, or gender identity and sexual identity, things like that might sit at the cross-section of 2 different demographic points of identity. The other thing we heard from the sponsors is a real appetite to work on activating this. DEI is a new thing to businesses. Now, Lori had mentioned in the chat that we heard about Target on research that I did with NPR back in a previous job. And Target has been seen as a very accessible brand for a long time, which speaks to the degree that this is a long-term commitment, and there are brands that have been at it for 10, 15, 20 years, but most brands are really new to this topic and really thinking about it. And so that aspect of really coming and doing some activation and workshopping and strategic planning around DEI is really important. So we're going to be integrating that and moving forward, and also allowing for more customization that's brand specific. So it's kind of high level where we're going to be going. Next slide. And there's a few topics that we've been hearing about. I alluded to a couple just now. Experience and identity in the workplace, and the implications of a hybrid workplace on different demographic groups is something that we're going to be exploring. Generations and workplace equity is going to be another topic. We know there's a lot out there about, Gen Z and how they're different, but we haven't really explored, Gen Z in different regions of the country, in different industries, across different racial groups, et cetera. Health and wellness is a big thing. We've been seeing in a lot of research lately that mental health is having not just a moment in a good way that we're allowed to talk about it now, but it's also coming out of COVID, a priority for workplaces to understand how to keep their employees well. As a business, all of us are business owners, so we all are thinking about that day in and day out. We're also going to be talking about financial equity and different aspects of the financial markets, including crypto, and how that's affecting people differentially, and the effect of finances on well-being. Since we concepted this, 2 banks have failed, right? So that's a big thing that's affecting people as well. And then, of course, we're going to take an intersectional look at all of this to really understand the future of work through a DEI lens. So next slide. So a couple ways, if you're interested, that you can become a change agent for your organization. We are still doing work with Words Matter. We can do more in-depth presentations of this. Again, like I said, we've got hours and hours of material here, not just 30 to 40 minutes. We can do activation sessions. We also do a communications audit. We built a rubric to look at internal versus external communications and where there might be a misalignment between how you talk about things internally and what you're saying externally. So we've built that for our sponsors in the past. And then, of course, getting involved in future of work. So if you're interested, our email is on here. It's just info@voicesofequity.com. We've got a QR code that you can scan here with your phone, and feel free to scan it. And there's a little form behind it that you can tell us what you're interested in, and then we'll reach back out to you and set up a meeting. We're going to be starting those meetings next week. And then we also encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. So you can see our LinkedIn handle here, or just scan that QR code and it'll take you right to our LinkedIn page, where we will also be uploading this webinar for any of your friends or colleagues that you want to see it. That will be available to them too. So I'm now going to pass it back to Delphine and Candace, who are going to open it up to Q&A and a dialogue.
Thank you. And Candace has been doing a great job in monitoring that chat. And I do have to say, this was great. This was great. And I know it's great because we have people from all over the world. And I just got to give a shout out. Tokyo, New Jersey, Canada, NYC, DC, China, Chicago, Greater Boston, Charlotte, Carrie, that's where you are, Southern California, Germany, Davison, London, Kenya, Cincinnati. Are we not global?
Yes, I love it.
We are global. I love it. But we did have a couple of questions. I want to go back up because Kristen had a question. I'm curious about the recruiting practices that were used to cast a wide net and inclusive/representative base to reach the more nuanced groups. So they want a little bit about our recruiting practices.
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. I can take that question. So, as a co-founder of MIC, I'm also one of the only ones that specializes in sample. So that's what Innovate MR is known for. And so this is obviously a topic that's very near and dear to me. I have to say, in all of my travels across the 20 years in the industry, Carrie stood out to me as just a stellar client for many reasons. One was that she would always come to us with very nested quotas and oversamples on diverse cohorts. And I have to say, sadly, she is kind of a lonely practitioner on this front from a lot of the different requests that we see coming in from clients. And so that's just something that I really want to stress here is there's so much intersectionality that the team here has covered today. And it really starts out with developing a really solid and representative sample frame. So what we see a lot in studies that cross my desk and requests that cross my desk from time to time are, fairly low base sizes. with no nested quota design to understand the intersectionality of age and gender and ethnicity. And what results with that methodology is that you're essentially just creating representation for the largest cohort, i.e. Caucasians. So you're not really amplifying those voices as you should be. But we took a very different approach. So we oversampled all of the key ethnic groups to make sure that we had a readable base. And we also did it, with nested quota design. So we could look at it from not just an ethnicity standpoint, but also folding in things like age and gender, where we saw, some stark differences, especially on the generational side of things. So that's number one, really, really important to develop that solid sample frame, make sure that you're oversampling on those diverse cohorts to get a proper representation. And then in terms of the recruitment strategy, we obviously did both quantitative and qualitative methodologies for our Words Matter project. We leveraged our panel, which is the Point Club database. This is a double opted-in panel of consumers, not only in America, but internationally. Obviously, this study was limited to the US general population, but our recruitment strategy is very robust. You might see in other panel companies where they'll leverage a few different affiliate publishers to drive most of the traffic into their registration page. At any given time, we have between 75 to 100 different recruitment campaigns with the focus of finding those hard to reach audiences that just naturally exist at a lower penetration rate in the population based on their footprint. So I could talk about sample for much longer, but I know we're close on time here. So Carrie, did you have some additional comments there?
Yeah, I would say the other couple things we thought about are we have people in our own group who are biracial, and so we made sure to have mixed race as a distinct identity in our research, and we had distinct focus groups with people who identify as mixed race, because we didn't want to lump that in with whatever they can, whatever we might consider to be the demographic break. We wanted their identity to be the demographic break, and that was really insightful. And then the other thing we did is look at country of origin for some of our work. So for example, that's actually really important in looking at Asian cohorts. And we fielded this in the middle of Stop Asian Hate. So you can imagine that if somebody was from China or a country that gets mistaken for China, we heard very different things from people in that cohort than from people who, for example, are from India. And they would be in the same group talking to us. So we knew to look for country of origin and how that might matter in particular in the moment we were in during sort of the spike of COVID. So those were two other things we did to really make sure we were being mindful of different experiences and perspectives.
Thank you. And I think I started something there. So I'm going to have to shout out to India and Tucson, Arizona. Thank you so much. Keeps the questions coming. We do have two other questions. The first one being, who is responsible for leading DEIB efforts internally? Who's responsible?
Everyone. So this is sort of I would not say that we are DEI strategists as an organization. So I think that does depend on the organization. And I'd love other people in the team to weigh in on this too. But even when there is a head of DEI, which we've seen at some brands and not at others, I do believe it's everyone's responsibility. And the position we're taking is that as researchers, it is our responsibility to lead this internally and externally, because DEI is only as effective as the measurements behind it, which I know is another conversation in the chat. How do we measure all this? Well, that's a question for our discipline to insert ourselves into. And so we're big believers of, regardless of the company structure we're working with, we have a role to play that's really important and that we should not overshadow or overlook.
And to Carrie's point, it really is everyone. What we've seen is that when it's not everyone and it's lumped just into the DEI group or this one specific team, it doesn't really get the internal momentum that it can to be impactful. So that's when you have projects that start and they end up on a shelf. And it's never fully actioned or implemented. And so it really does take leaders from every facet of the organization being a part of it and driving it for it to truly be successful.
And I just wanted to add that when we spoke to consumers and they relate to us their experiences, particularly people from diverse groups, they themselves see this is more a systematic issue in many companies. No matter what group they are in, they are receiving a lot of bad feedback on their presence in those organizations. They affect the motivation, their sense of belonging, regardless if they're women or Black or Hispanics, whatever diversity, intersectionality they live at, that really permeates the culture of the company. So when you go about culture, it means that everybody has to be involved, and it's about structure, creating the spaces where that can happen. It's about education of those in management, but in the communication, understanding what is that the process at the base needs to happen. That's why we stress the idea of co-creation. And it's just not about the management team saying you need to have this training or this program, or you have to belong to these ERGs, because when it comes top down, really it doesn't grow organically. It doesn't get internalized, and there is a lot of resistance and there is a lot of backlash because people are not prepared to that type of mind shift. And so that's, I think, what happened with Target is they have been tackled this issue from many fronts and all levels, and you can see it now. You can see it in the products, in their employees, in their advertising, spills over and becomes kind of organic and natural. People don't question it. Even the most reticent they feel like that's part of it. And so it's important that everybody is involved, but essentially it has to come from the top down in terms of they have to invest in this, but the program, really the build up comes from the bottom up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Next question. How did you define advocates versus consumers? And how did you account for any overlap between these two groups?
I can take this one. We didn't define it, they did. So one of the things we actually were looking for consumers who talked about the experience of, like, the definition of multicultural, or who talked about DEI in different online forums, people who are already chatting about this. And what we learned about them is that they are, in fact, for the most part, advocates of DEI and representation. And so that conversation is an advocacy culture for the most part. But different stages of our research looked at different types of people, right? So that first stage of research, when we were looking at a digital anthropology, it surfaced conversations that were happening organically online already. And so fundamentally, those were more advocacy cultures, people who were very overt about these conversations and proactive about them. Whereas when we got into later groups, we didn't define that at all. Some of the people in our groups were very clearly advocates. Some of them were very clearly naysayers, and some of them were just sort of bystanders and kind of ambivalent about it. But we had all of the above in our research, and we let them define for us, what does advocacy look like? What do you believe advocacy is? And we didn't try to do that for them.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for those. And Janet had one, and thank you, Candace. Hopefully we got the essence of your question. Janet asked, is the current name MIC found to be too limiting? Equity Insights Collective, Inclusive Insights Collective. And now after the 2020's founding, should we perhaps consider a more inclusive name that goes beyond cultural and ethnic groups to embrace all aspects of individuality and diversity, such as identity, age, religion, body type, other differences?
You guys are going to have to get new headbands.
I know, right?
No, I'm committed to the headband, Janet.
Yeah.
It took me many hours to do that.
A lot of bedazzling on that.
I would argue with, so I think it has to do with how you see the word multicultural, right? And the multicultural, depending on the context, in the US tends to be mostly connected to, for many people, to race, or mostly race. But multicultural is more than race, right? And so instead of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is an aspect of it that has sociological implications, economical, political, I would argue that multicultural is pretty broad and can include many of the dimensions that we have been talking. That's why I think that's part of what we are kind of at the essence of our group, because our group is very diverse. And I would say I'm very proud that we're able to represent, for example, the multiracial group there. I am a representative, never finding any surveys and studies, unless you do the census, which allow for multiple choice questions many times. But that's the aspect that we need to keep going on the conversation. What does that mean? What does that word mean in the context of the research we're doing? And it goes beyond because now there is a little bit of a DEI fatigue after too much exposure of the last 2 years, and people are kind of getting away from it, going back to the old habits. But still, we still are part of different cultures, of different identity groups, and each of them they have their own little subculture. And so I think culture is a great word for this, but that's my argument.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. And it's interesting. I'm going back to a study that we did at Research Narrative before we founded MIC. Actually, it was one of the things that got me interested in the topic of multicultural, which was a project about defining that word. And one of the things that was really interesting to me coming out of that project, this is back in like 2016, is that the way we often define it in the insights field is we say it to mean not white. And that's just not correct. That's not how consumers think of the word. And so I fully agree with everything Michelle has said. I think what we heard when we did that work is multicultural has regionality to it. It has hobbies, it has personal experiences. So we would hear about, in the South, the cultural tenet might be football and tailgating, And so if you are talking about youth culture without that, you're kind of missing the point, right? I would say I live in Charlotte, like a couple other people on this call. HBCUs are a big part of the culture here, right? And that was not true when I lived on the West Coast. It was different. And so there are different aspects of culture. And so I think what we are aiming to do is heighten the meaning of that word and honor it as it should be honored, rather than kind of simplify or even neuter that word, and really bring to it all that it could and should be.
Thank you so much. And Candace and I would like to pass it back to Lisa. We've just got about 3 minutes.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate everyone joining us. I think it's just been such an insightful presentation. I hope everyone tuning in really enjoyed it. I have to say, it's just such a privilege and honor to get to collaborate with all these amazing researchers. We meet every Friday for about an hour and a half, and I look forward to those sessions. We uncover so much together. And so we're really excited for our upcoming project. Certainly for those listening, and if you're interested, you would just want to kind of talk shop offline, feel free to reach out to us. It's voicesofequity.com. And our email is info@voicesofequity.com. So please reach out, connect to us on LinkedIn. But in the meantime, I hope everyone here has a wonderful day ahead. And thanks again for joining. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.